October 14th, 1757, the Upper Kennebec River, Maine Territory. The air bites. It carries the scent of damp earth, decaying maple leaves, and the sharp, clean promise of a winter that will be long and unforgiving. You are here, standing in a silence so profound it feels like a presence. The only sounds are the rustle of a vole in the underbrush and the whisper of the north wind through the skeletal fingers of birch trees. The light is gray and thin, filtered through a ceiling of overcast sky that presses down on the forest, muting the vibrant death of autumn's colors into shades of rust and old blood. A fine mist clings to the dark, moss-covered trunks of ancient hemlocks, each droplet a perfect, cold sphere. This is the Andakina, the ancestral homeland of the Abenaki people. It breathes around you. And through this breathing world moves a man who is as much a part of it as the granite bones of the earth beneath his feet. His name is Metakolan. He hides. The name is a description of his skill, not his character. He moves with a liquid grace that makes the crisp leaves barely sigh under the soft soles of his hide moccasins. His body, lean and corded with muscle, is a study in efficiency. He wears buckskin leggings and a simple breechcloth, his torso bare to the cold air, his skin weathered like seasoned wood. A single eagle feather is tied into his long black hair. In his right hand, he carries his hunting spear. It is not a weapon of ceremony, it is a tool, an extension of his will. The shaft is fire-hardened ash, just over 5 feet in length, smoothed by the patient work of his own hands until it feels like an old friend. To an outsider, a European soldier accustomed to the 14-foot reach of a military pike or the long steel of a bayonet, it would look unimpressively short, a child's toy, perhaps. But Metakolan knows its truth. It was born of these woods, for these woods. Its length is measured not against the open fields of Europe, but against the tight, tangled embrace of the forest, where a long shaft is a clumsy liability, easily caught in a branch or a thorny vine. The spearhead is not of stone, but of dark, trade iron, hammered and sharpened to a wicked point by the French blacksmiths down at the fortress of Carillon. It is bound to the shaft with wet deer sinew, which has dried to the hardness of stone. As he moves, he scans the forest floor, his eyes missing nothing. The scrape of a buck's antler against a sapling, the disturbed loam where a turkey scratched for grubs, the subtle indentation of a rabbit's path. He is hunting, but his senses are tuned to something more than just the scent of deer. For weeks, a disquiet has settled over his village of Norridgewock. The wind carries more than the chill of the coming snows. It carries whispers of new movements, of a new arrogance from the English to the south. He freezes. It is not a sound that stops him, but a lack of one, a pocket of unnatural stillness in the woods ahead. The birds have fallen silent. His grip on the ash spear tightens, the muscles in his forearm coiling. He sinks into a crouch, becoming one with the shadow of a great white pine. He waits, his breathing slow and even, his heart a steady drum against his ribs. Minutes pass. The forest holds its breath with him. Then a sound that does not belong, a sharp metallic clink, the sound of a steel boot heel striking stone. It is followed by a low cough, rough and phlegmy, foreign, English. Metakolan melts backwards, deeper into the trees, his movements so fluid he seems to be a part of the shifting shadows. He circles, moving downwind, his moccasins making no more noise than falling pine needles. From behind the dense screen of a rhododendron thicket, he sees them. There are 6 of them, Not soldiers in their bright, foolish red coats, but something else. Rangers, or perhaps surveyors. They wear drab green and brown wool, practical clothing for the forest, but they move with the heavy, ground-punishing tread of men who do not belong here. They carry long rifles, hatchets at their belts, and one of them is unrolling a parchment map against the trunk of a tree. The other two are driving wooden stakes into the ground, a length of chain stretched between them. They are measuring the land, his land. A cold anger, clean and sharp as a shard of ice, settles in Metakolan's gut. This is the source of the disquiet. They are not just passing through. They are not just a patrol hunting for French allies. They are here to cut the heart out of the forest, to divide it into squares and sell it, to build their ugly, angular towns where the pines have stood for 1,000 years. One of the men, a thick-set individual with a coarse red beard, leans his rifle against a tree and pulls a flask from his coat. He takes a long drink, wipes his mouth with the back of his hand, and spits on the ground. The gesture, so casual and so full of contempt, is like a physical blow. This land is sacred. Every stream, every rock, every tree is part of a story, part of his people. To these men, it is just dirt and timber, a commodity to be conquered and consumed. Metakolan watches them for an hour, memorizing their faces, their weapons, the way they move. They are confident, loud, oblivious to the countless eyes of the forest that are watching them. They believe themselves to be masters of this new world, blind to the fact that they are merely clumsy temporary guests. When they finally pack up their chains and maps and move on, lumbering south, Metakolan waits until the echo of their voices has been completely swallowed by the woods. He moves to the place where they stood. He sees the deep impressions of their heavy boots, the discarded remnant of a salt pork biscuit, and the offensive yellow stain of urine in the moss. He kneels and touches the raw, splintered wood of the survey stake they have hammered into the earth. It is an alien thing, a violation. He wraps his hand around it and pulls. The wet soil resists, but his strength is deep and patient. With a sucking sound, the stake comes free. He examines it for a moment, then, with a sharp crack, breaks it over his knee. He throws the pieces into the undergrowth. This is not enough. This is a single weed pulled from a garden that is about to be overrun. He knows what he must do. The journey back to his village is not a hunt, it is a race. He moves at a steady, ground-eating trot, his body a perfectly calibrated machine. He reads the terrain effortlessly, taking the path of least resistance, his internal map of this vast forest as clear and detailed as the Englishman's parchment. He crosses streams on moss-slicked stones, his balance unerring. He climbs steep ridges, his hands finding holds in rocks and roots, as if they have done so 1,000 times, which they have. The sun, a pale disk in the gray sky, begins to dip toward the horizon, casting long, distorted shadows that writhe like living things. As dusk bleeds into the forest, the air grows colder still, and the first hint of wood smoke reaches him. It is the scent of home. He sees the warm, flickering lights of the lodges through the trees. The village of Noridjawak is nestled in a bend of the river, protected and hidden. Its structures are not the log cabins of the colonists, but traditional wigwams. Their birch bark and hide coverings blend into the surrounding woods. He doesn't slow his pace until he reaches the edge of the clearing. The sounds of the village wash over him, the laughter of children, the rhythmic thump of a woman pounding corn into meal, the low murmur of conversation. A pack of dogs, lean and wolf-like, rush out to greet him, barking joyfully before recognizing his scent and falling into step beside him, tails wagging. He walks past his own lodge, where he knows his wife, Anyidabi, is waiting, where the smell of roasting venison would normally make his stomach ache with hunger. But tonight, the hunger in his gut is for something else. He goes directly to the largest structure in the village, the council lodge. He pushes aside the heavy hide flap and steps into the smoky warmth. The elders are gathered around the central fire pit, their faces maps of time and wisdom illuminated by the dancing flames. Among them is the Sagamore, Chief Paugus, a man whose eyes hold the memory of winter's Metakolan can only imagine. Also present is a man who is not Abenaki, Captain Jean-Vincent d'Abadi de Saint-Castin, a French officer from Fort Pantagoet. He wears the deerskin.
The first snows of November have dusted the high peaks, a stark white warning against the deep gray of the sky. But down in the river valleys, the English persist. Lieutenant Alastair Finch of His Majesty's 44th Regiment of Foot considered the landscape with a profound and personal sense of revulsion. To him, this was not a world teeming with life, but a monotonous, suffocating prison of trees, endless, silent, and hostile. He hated the way the dense canopy swallowed the light, the way the dampness seeped into his bones, and the incessant, maddening silence that was, he was sure, filled with watching eyes. He stood on a newly cleared rise, the raw, muddy earth a wound in the forest floor. Below him his men toiled, a company of redcoats, their uniforms already stained with mud and sweat, worked alongside a rougher-looking contingent of colonial militia from Massachusetts. They were a study in contrasts, the regulars moving with the drilled, if clumsy, precision of the British Army, their motions stiff and ill-suited to the terrain. The colonials more at ease, their swings of the axe more natural, but lacking the discipline Finch valued above all else. They were cutting a road, a great wide scar through the wilderness, felling ancient pines and hemlocks that had stood since before his nation was even a thought. The air was thick with the scent of freshly cut wood and the rhythmic, percussive din of 200 axes biting into timber, a sound that echoed unnervingly in the oppressive quiet. "Progress, Sergeant Harris?" Finch asked, not turning his head. He was a young man, barely 25, but he held himself with the ramrod straightness and haughty confidence of a man twice his age and rank. His uniform was immaculate despite the surroundings, his powdered wig a startling white against the drab greens and browns of the forest. Sergeant Elias Harris materialized at his elbow, his presence as quiet and solid as one of the oaks they were felling. Harris was Finch's opposite in every way. A veteran of the bloody fields of Flanders, his face was a leathery mask, his uniform worn and practical, and his eyes, deep-set and weary, missed nothing. He had spent more time on campaign than Finch had been alive. "Begging your pardon, sir," Harris said carefully, "but the men are spooked. Young Private Miller from the 3rd Platoon swore he saw a face in the leaves yesterday, and 2 of the militia lads sent to scout the flank this morning haven't returned. It's been over 3 hours. Finch finally turned to look at his sergeant, his thin lips pressed into a line of annoyance. "Miller is a superstitious farm boy from Yorkshire who likely saw his own reflection in a puddle. As for the colonials, they've probably gotten themselves lost chasing a squirrel. They have no discipline. This entire enterprise is slowed by their incompetence." "They know these woods better than we do, sir," Harris countered gently. "They say we make too much noise. They call us the red caterpillars, crawling through the forest, easy to see, easy to track." A flicker of anger tightened Finch's jaw. "I'll not have my men, soldiers of the king, skulking through the undergrowth like frightened rabbits, Sergeant. We are here to demonstrate the strength and resolve of the British Empire. We advance with drums beating and colors flying. Let the savages see us. Let them tremble." But the savages were not trembling. They were watching. Miles away, yet feeling every vibration of the English axes through the soles of his feet, Metakolan lay on his stomach atop a granite outcrop, concealed by a fan of ferns. Beside him were a dozen warriors, the first to answer Norajawak's call. They were ghosts, wrapped in wolf hides and deerskins that made them vanish into the texture of the forest. They had been shadowing the red caterpillars for 3 days, a silent, unseen plague. They watched the soldiers toil, their bright red coats absurdly visible against the forest gloom. They listened to their loud shouts, the cracking of their whips on the oxen that pulled the supply wagons, the ceaseless clangor of their work. The English were like noisy children, blind and deaf to the world they were invading. "They are slow," whispered a young warrior named Chogan, his hand resting on the stock of a French musket. Metakolan put a hand on the young man's arm. "Patience," he murmured, his voice like the rustle of leaves. "A wolf does not attack the head of the caribou. It weakens it from the edges. It harries the herd, makes it fearful, makes it clumsy. We are too few to destroy them here, but we can bleed them. We can make them fear the shadows." And so began the Shadow War. It was a war of nerves, a campaign of 1,000 small cuts. It did not begin with a volley of musketry or a terrifying war cry. It began with silence. The 2 colonial scouts did not return because they had walked into a perfectly laid snare. A taut whine hidden beneath the leaves had caught an ankle, and before the second man could even turn, a hatchet, thrown with silent, deadly accuracy, had buried itself in the base of his skull. The first man had his throat cut before he could make a sound. Their bodies were not left for their comrades to find. They were simply gone, vanished from the earth, as if the forest itself had consumed them. Their disappearance was a question mark that hung over the English camp, a seed of fear planted in the minds of every soldier. The next day, a sentry posted at the edge of the expanding clearing was found dead at dawn, slumped against a tree with a single arrow in his throat. He had not cried out. No one had heard a thing. The arrow was unadorned, made of local wood, with gray goose fletching. It was a message: "We are here. We are always here." Lieutenant Finch responded with fury. He doubled the sentries, ordered them to stand in pairs, and sent out armed patrols in every direction. The patrols found nothing. They marched in tight formations through the dense woods, their muskets held at the ready, seeing nothing but trees, hearing nothing but the pounding of their own hearts. But they were being watched. Metakolan's warriors flitted along their flanks, always out of sight, phantoms in the periphery. They would let the patrol pass, then strike at the rear. A single warrior would rise from a log, fire a musket from point-blank range into the back of the last soldier, and melt back into the woods before his comrades could even turn around. The English would crash into the trees, firing their muskets blindly at shadows, their volley a deafening but useless roar in the vast emptiness. By the time the smoke cleared, there was nothing there but a dead or wounded man and the mocking call of a blue jay. The psychological toll was immense. The soldiers, far from home and steeped in terrifying tales of savage warfare, began to see an enemy in every shadow. A snapping twig was a warrior sneaking up on them. The hoot of an owl at dusk was a signal. They grew jumpy, irritable. Fights broke out in the camp at night. Men who had faced French cannons at Fontenay now flinched at the rustle of leaves. Sergeant Harris saw the decay, and it worried him deeply. He approached Finch as he was studying his maps in his tent. "Sir, with respect, this strategy isn't working. We're losing men every day, and we've yet to see a single one of the bastards. The men's morale is cracking." Finch looked up from his maps, his eyes cold. "And what would you suggest, Sergeant? That we abandon our mission, run back to the safety of Albany with our tails between our legs because a few of our men have been picked off by skulking cowards?" "No, sir," Harris said, keeping his voice even. "I suggest we change our tactics, adopt some of their own. Send out smaller, faster parties, men dressed in buckskin, not scarlet, men who know how to move quietly. We fight fire with fire." "We are British soldiers, not savages," Finch snapped, rising to his feet. "We fight in the open, with honor. We will not adopt the cowardly tactics of our enemy. The solution is not to hide, but to press on with greater speed and force. We will build a blockhouse at the next river crossing, a fortified position. Let them come." The breaking point for Lieutenant Alastair Finch came on a bitter, windswept morning in late November. It arrived in the form of a wagon, or what was left of it. A small supply convoy, just 2 wagons escorted by a corporal and 6 men, had been dispatched to the rear for flour and salt pork. It was less than 5 miles back to the last fortified depot, a journey that should have taken half a day. They never arrived. A patrol sent to find them discovered the scene in a narrow defile where the half-finished road was flanked by steep wooded banks. The scene was one of chilling, methodical destruction. The wagons had been burned. The charred skeletons of the oxen lay in their yokes, and the air was thick with the sickeningly sweet smell of roasted flesh and burnt grain. The bodies of the 7 soldiers were there, but they had been arranged in a grotesque tableau. They were laid out in a line beside the road, stripped of their uniforms, weapons, and boots. Each man had been scalped. On each man's chest, a single dead crow had been placed. It was a message of utter contempt, a declaration. When Sergeant Harris returned with the patrol, the faces of his men were ashen. Finch, summoned to the scene, stared at the carnage, his face a mask of controlled fury. His jaw was clenched so tightly that a muscle jumped in his cheek. He walked down the line of his dead men, his polished boots stepping carefully around the pools of frozen blood. He stopped at the body of the corporal, a young man he'd personally commended for his drill just a week before. He stared at the savaged ruin of the man's head, at the black bird sitting mockingly on his pale chest. It was a personal insult, a direct challenge to his authority, to the power of the uniform he wore, to the very concept of civilized warfare. "Savages," he whispered, the word a puff of white vapor in the cold air. "Barbaric, godless savages." He turned to Harris, his eyes blazing with a cold fire. This is not warfare. This is butchery. They fight like animals, so we will hunt them like animals." "Sir," Harris began, his voice low, "this was a trap. They knew our schedule. They knew our numbers. They chose the ground. We should fall back to the depot, consolidate our forces and wait for reinforcements. It's what they don't want us to do." Finch laughed, a short, ugly bark that held no humor. "Fall back? Sergeant, you are beginning to sound like a coward. We will do the opposite. We will do what they don't expect. They harry our flanks. They attack our supply lines because they are too weak to face us in a direct confrontation. They hide in the woods because they are terrified of our bayonets.
I will no longer play their game of hide and seek." He strode over to his horse, which a nervous orderly was holding. He pulled himself into the saddle and looked down at his men, his voice ringing with renewed, if brittle, authority. "They have a village somewhere to the northeast, their base of operations, their nest, the source of this infection. I have a captive colonial scout, a man named Webb, who claims he was taken to it years ago. He believes he can find it again. I will take a detachment, 50 of our best men, the fastest and fittest. We will leave light and move fast. No wagons, no cannons, just musket, bayonets, and righteous fury. We will leave the main force here to continue the road work and guard the camp under your command, Sergeant." Harris's heart sank. This was madness. A small, fast-moving force would be even more vulnerable, cut off from support, plunging deeper into the very wilderness that was their enemy. "Lieutenant, I must protest," Harris said, stepping forward. "You'll be walking into their arms. The entire forest is their fortress. A small force, it's suicide." Finch's eyes narrowed into slits. "Your protest is noted, Sergeant, and it is overruled. Your job is to hold this position. My job is to eradicate the enemy. Is that clear? Assemble the men I've selected. Rations for 3 days, 100 rounds per man. We march within the hour." He wheeled his horse around and galloped back towards the main camp, leaving Harris standing amidst the dead, the cold wind whipping at his coat. The sergeant looked at the frozen bodies of his comrades, then at the dark, silent wall of trees. Finch was not just marching into the enemy's arms, he was marching to his own destruction, and he was taking 50 good men with him. From a high ridge a mile to the east, Metakolan watched the commotion in the English camp through a small French spyglass. He had orchestrated the attack on the convoy, and the result was exactly as he had intended. It was not mere cruelty, it was a calculated act of psychological warfare. The scalping was a message of defiance, the crows a symbol of mockery. He wanted to infuriate the English commander, to wound his pride, to make him abandon his cautious, methodical advance and do something rash. Now, as he watched a distinct column of 50 soldiers form up near the commander's tent, he knew his gambit had worked. They were taking the bait. He lowered the spyglass, a grim satisfaction settling over him. He turned to the warriors gathered behind him. Among them was Kankamagus, the old scarred hunter. "The young chief is angry," Metakolan said. "He has taken the hook. He is leaving the herd." Kankamagus nodded, a slow, thoughtful motion. "An angry bear is strong, but it is blind. It charges into the spear. Where do you think he goes?" "He seeks our home," Metakolan replied. "He thinks to burn us out. He will follow the river north. It is the only path he knows." "Then we must choose the ground where the bear will die," Kankamagus said. Metakolan's mind was already working, picturing the landscape ahead of the English detachment. He saw the winding river, the steep ridges, the swamps, the thickets, and he saw one place in particular, a place a few miles upstream where the river narrowed and the forest pressed in close, forcing the animal trail they would be following through a deep, narrow ravine. A place of tangled undergrowth, fallen trees, and high, rocky sides. A place where 50 men would be like fish in a net. "There is a ravine north of the Crooked Falls," Metakolan said. "The pines there whisper to each other when the wind blows. It is a good place to listen, a good place for the English to hear our answer." The decision was made. Runners were dispatched, silent figures who melted into the forest, carrying word to other Abenaki war parties in the area. The message was simple. The trap was being set. They were to converge on the ravine of whispering pines and wait. Metakolan and his own small band would take the most dangerous task. They would shadow Finch's detachment, staying close, letting themselves be seen just enough to lure the English deeper and deeper into the wilderness, pulling them towards the designated killing ground. The march began. Lieutenant Finch pushed his men hard, forcing a brutal pace. He was driven by a cold, vengeful energy. With him at the head of the column was the colonial scout, Webb, a wiry, nervous man whose eyes darted constantly towards the trees. "Are you certain of this path, Webb?" demanded Finch, his voice sharp. "It's been years, sir," Webb stammered, "but the lay of the land feels right. The river bends here, just as I remember. The village, It should be no more than a day's march. All the while they were being herded. Metakolan's warriors were masters of this game. A single warrior would show himself for a fleeting moment on a distant ridge, drawing a volley of frustrated and useless musket fire from the redcoats. A fresh track, too obvious to be real, would be left on the trail, pulling them forward. At night, when the exhausted English made camp, the Abenaki would circle them, calling out insults in broken English, taunting them, denying them rest. "Redcoats, we have your women!" one would cry, followed by chilling laughter that seemed to come from all directions at once. Finch gritted his teeth and ordered his men to ignore the phantoms, but the taunts, combined with the exhaustion and the ever-present fear, were fraying their nerves to the breaking point. They were being drawn onward, deeper into a world that was utterly alien to them. The forest grew thicker, the trees larger and more ancient. The trail narrowed, enforcing them into a single long file. The air grew still and heavy. The sounds of their own passage, the crunch of their boots on the forest floor, the clink of their equipment, their own ragged breathing, seemed unnaturally loud. They were walking into the heart of the spider's web. On the evening of the second day, they reached the entrance to the ravine. The trail sloped downwards into a gloomy chasm carved by the river over thousands of years. The sides were steep and cluttered with moss-covered boulders and tangled roots. Great pines, whose tops were lost in the twilight, leaned inwards, their branches interlocking to form a dark, oppressive ceiling. The river gurgled somewhere to their right, unseen in the gloom. Sergeant Harris, who had been relegated to a position in the middle of the column, felt a prickle of profound unease. He had marched through the mountain passes of Scotland and the dark forests of Germany, and he knew a bad place when he saw one. This was a textbook ambush site. He pushed his way to the front of the column where Finch had halted, studying the path ahead. "Sir, we should not enter this place," Harris said, his voice an urgent whisper. "Not at dusk. We should make camp on the high ground here and wait for morning light. We can't see the flanks. We'd be slaughtered in there." Finch turned on him, his face pale and taut in the dying light. "We are 2 days' march from the main force, Sergeant. Our rations are low. The enemy is close, I can feel it. We will push through this ravine and make camp on the other side. The scout says the land opens up ahead. We are not stopping. Now get back to your position." Finch spurred his horse forward, the animal picking its way nervously down the rocky path into the growing darkness. The soldiers, weary and filled with a nameless dread, followed their commander into the jaws of the ravine. They moved like condemned men, their eyes.
The air inside the ravine was 10 degrees colder than the high ground they had just left. It was a pocket of deep, damp cold that clung to the soldiers' wool coats and seemed to leach the warmth from their very marrow. The light failed almost completely, trapped by the interlocking canopy of the ancient pines high above. What little illumination remained was a bruised, twilight purple, rendering everything in monochrome shades of black and gray. They were at the bottom of a deep green trench, and the feeling of being enclosed, of being watched, was overpowering. Lieutenant Finch, despite his outward projection of confidence, felt it too. The hairs on the back of his neck prickled. He strained his ears, but could hear nothing over the gurgle of the river and the clumsy progress of his own men. The path was treacherous, littered with loose stones and slick roots that twisted like serpents across the trail. Men stumbled, cursing under their breath, the sound swallowed by the ravine's oppressive silence. The column became stretched out, ragged. The disciplined line Finch so valued had disintegrated into a straggling file of exhausted, nervous men. They were halfway through the ravine when it happened. It did not begin with a war cry. A war cry was for frightening an enemy you intended to let run away. This was not about fear. It was about extermination. It began with a sound, a single piercing note that was not quite human and not quite animal. It was the call of a hawk, sharp and clear, echoing off the rock walls. It was Metakolan's signal. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. The soldiers looked up, confused. Then the world exploded. It was not a single volley from a unified firing line. It was a storm of death that erupted from everywhere at once.
From the lip of the ravine high above, from behind boulders just feet from the path, from the dense thickets of mountain laurel they had just passed. Puffs of gray smoke blossomed all along the ravine walls as dozens of French muskets, far more accurate and faster to load than the soldiers' own brown Bess muskets, fired down into the trapped column. The sound was deafening, a continuous, rolling thunder that was magnified and distorted by the enclosed space. Lead balls, heavy and devastating at this close range, tore through the air. They struck flesh with wet, meaty thuds. They splintered musket stocks and ricocheted off the rock walls with angry whines. Men screamed and fell, their bright red coats making them tragically easy targets in the gloom. A private marching directly behind Finch cried out, a choked, gurgling sound, and pitched forward onto his face, a musket ball having shattered his spine. Finch's horse reared, screaming in terror as a ball grazed its flank and threw him to the ground. He landed hard, the air knocked from his lungs, his ears ringing from the cacophony. Dazed, he scrambled behind a small rock outcropping, drawing his pistol. "Form a line!" he roared, his voice thin and reedy against the storm of gunfire. "Volley fire! Return fire!" It was a textbook command for a European battlefield. Here, it was a death sentence. A few of the veteran regulars, acting on pure instinct, tried to obey. They formed a ragged line, shoulder to shoulder, and brought their heavy muskets up. But who were they to shoot at? The enemy was invisible, hidden behind 1,000 points of cover. The smoke from their own muskets, thick and acrid, hung heavy in the windless air of the ravine, further obscuring their vision. "Present! Fire!" a sergeant screamed. The volley was ragged, a dozen muskets firing as one. It was a gesture of defiance, but a futile one. The massive lead balls tore harmlessly into the trees and rocks on the far side of the ravine. The crash of the volley was their only answer. Before they could even begin the clumsy multi-step process of reloading, another wave of shots tore into their ranks from the shadows. Men who had been standing a second ago were now writhing on the ground. The neatly formed line dissolved into chaos. It was a turkey shoot. Soldiers abandoned any pretense of formation and dove for whatever cover they could find, behind trees, rocks, with the bodies of their fallen comrades. Panic, cold and absolute, began to take hold. And then from the upstream end of the ravine, blocking their path of advance, came a new sound, a terrifying, ululating cry that seemed to claw at the very soul. Kankamagus and a score of warriors rose from the earth itself, their faces painted in stark patterns of red and black, their hands holding not muskets, but heavy war clubs and razor-sharp tomahawks. They did not charge in a straight line, but flowed down the path like a deadly tide, weaving between the trees. The effect on the pinned-down soldiers was devastating. They were caught in a classic pincer movement, trapped between an invisible enemy firing from the high ground and a very visible, very terrifying enemy charging their front. "Stand your ground!" Finch yelled, finding his feet. He fired his pistol at the charging warriors, the shot going wide in his haste. "Fix bayonets! Repel the charge!" Again the command was instinctual, and again it was wrong. The long 17-inch bayonets, so brutally effective in open-field charges, were a clumsy liability here. The soldiers who managed to fix them found their weapons unwieldy, their points catching in the dense undergrowth. The charging Abenaki were on them in seconds. The fighting that erupted was not the ordered clash of armies. It was a savage, intimate brawl. A warrior would leap from a boulder onto the back of an unsuspecting redcoat, his tomahawk rising and falling in a single brutal arc. Another would slide under the clumsy lunge of a bayonet and drive his knife up under the soldier's ribs. The war clubs, heavy knobs of ironwood, crushed skulls and shattered limbs with sickening crunches. The redcoats, trained for line battles and volley fire, were completely out of their element. They were fighting not just a superior guerrilla force, but the environment itself. Through this maelstrom, Metakolan moved. He had fired his own musket from the rim of the ravine, then cast it aside. He now carried only his spear and a hatchet. He did not join the frontal charge. Instead, he descended the steep ravine wall like a goat, using rocks and roots as handholds, dropping into the very middle of the chaotic melee. He was not a berserker, howling and screaming. He was a silent, focused predator. His eyes, accustomed to the forest's gloom, saw everything. He saw a young private, no older than 16, paralyzed with fear, fumbling to reload his musket. He saw a burly sergeant trying to rally 2 other men into a back-to-back triangle of defense. He saw Lieutenant Finch, his fine coat torn and smeared with dirt, frantically trying to reload his pistol, his face a mask of disbelief and rage. Metakolan's movements were economical and precise. He flowed through the fight, a blur of buckskin and dark purpose. He saw a soldier swing the butt of his musket at a warrior's head. Before the blow could land, Metakolan's hatchet spun through the air, burying itself in the soldier's neck. He retrieved the weapon without breaking stride. He was the spirit of the ravine, an avenging ghost made of flesh and blood, defending his home with a cold, clear-eyed lethality. Sergeant Harris, unlike most of the others, had not panicked. When the first shots rained down, the old veteran had simply dropped to his belly behind a thick fallen log, dragging a terrified young private down with him. "Stay down, lad. Don't fire. Don't make a sound. Let them waste their powder." From his position, he had a grim, ground-level view of the unfolding slaughter. He watched the futility of their training, the uselessness of their equipment in this kind of fight. He watched as the painted warriors tore into their ranks, and a cold certainty settled in his stomach. None of them were getting out of this ravine alive. He saw Finch, trying to command a battle that was no longer a battle, but a simple execution. The lieutenant was brave, Harris would grant him that. Foolish, arrogant, but brave. He had managed to reload his pistol, and was now shouting orders that no one could hear, trying to create a pocket of resistance. The initial storm of musket fire from the heights began to slacken. The warriors on the rim, having broken the enemy's will and formation, were now descending into the ravine to join the close-quarters fight. The trap had been sprung, and now the hunters were moving in to finish the kill. The whispers of the pines high above were drowned out by the screams of dying men. The Abenaki moved with a terrifying synergy, calling to each other in short, sharp cries, pointing out targets, flowing around pockets of resistance, always flanking, always striking from an unexpected angle. They were not a mob, they were a pack of wolves, working together with an instinctual and deadly grace. Metakolan paused behind a massive, moss-covered boulder, taking a moment to read the shifting chaos of the fight. The initial charge had broken the front of the English column. The rear was in disarray, being picked off by the warriors descending from the cliffs. The trap had been sprung, and now the hunters were moving in to finish the kill.
The chaos in the ravine had coalesced around Lieutenant Finch's desperate last stand. The 10 or so surviving soldiers, a mix of regulars and a few colonial militiamen, stood shoulder to shoulder, their backs pressed together. They formed a tight, frightened circle, their bayonets a jagged ring of steel pointing out into the gloomy forest. Their faces were pale with terror and exertion, smeared with black powder and, for some, blood. They were a tiny island of discipline in an ocean of carnage, but the tide was rising around them. Finch was at their center, his sword in one hand, his reloaded pistol in the other. His wig was gone, lost in his fall, and his dark hair was matted to his scalp with sweat. His officer's sash was torn, but his voice, though strained, still carried the sharp edge of command. "Steady, men, hold the line, make them pay for every inch." His words were meant to inspire, but they sounded hollow against the backdrop of his men's ragged, panicked breathing. They were surrounded by the dead and dying. The ravine floor was a butcher's yard of red coats and pale limbs. From the shadows beyond their ring of steel, the forest watched them. Figures flitted between trees, their movements silent and menacing. The air was thick with the coppery smell of blood. Sergeant Harris was part of this circle. He stood beside a young private named Clark, a boy from Cornwall with wide, terrified eyes, who was trembling so violently that the barrel of his musket shook. Harris, by contrast, was unnervingly calm. His face was a grim mask of resignation. He knew this was the end. His movements were steady and economical as he held his bayoneted musket at the ready, its long steel point wavering only with his breathing. He wasn't thinking of Flanders anymore, or of home. His entire world had shrunk to this small circle of doomed men and the dark, menacing trees that surrounded them. "Keep your point level, Clark," Harris said, his voice a low rumble next to the boy's ear. "Don't lunge. Let them come onto the steel, and stay close. For God's sake, stay close." Clark nodded dumbly, swallowing hard. He shuffled his feet, pressing his back so tightly against Harris's that the sergeant could feel the boy shaking. This was the instinct of herding animals, to bunch together in the face of a predator, seeking safety in numbers, creating a wall of horns, or in this case, steel. It was a sound tactic on an open field. Here, it would prove to be a fatal mistake. Metakolan watched this desperate formation from the cover of a thicket of ferns not 20 yards away. He saw the fear in their eyes, but he also saw the danger in their bayonets. A direct frontal assault would be costly. The English soldiers, for all their clumsiness in the woods, were well drilled in the use of that weapon. He could see their training in the way they held their ground, in the disciplined manner they presented their points. But he also saw their weakness. They were static. They had surrendered the initiative, allowing the forest to close in around them. And they were huddled too close together. He gripped his spear, the smooth, fire-hardened ash warm against his palm. He had used it to take deer and bear. He had defended his home against Mohawk raiders with it. Every inch of the weapon was known to him. He knew its balance, its weight. He knew the precise moment in a thrust to put the full power of his legs and hips into the blow. His ancestors had designed this weapon not for the reach, but for the thrust, for delivering devastating power in a confined space, a space exactly like this. He saw the opening. It was between Sergeant Harris and the terrified Private Clark. They stood almost perfectly aligned. Clark slightly behind Harris and to his left, their bodies overlapping from Metakolan's perspective. Their proximity, meant for mutual support, created a single, deep target. It was a chance, a difficult, risky one, but a chance nonetheless. To hesitate was to die. Metakolan broke cover. He did not scream or yell. His attack was one of silent, explosive motion. He burst from the ferns, his body low to the ground, covering the 20 yards in a handful of powerful strides. The soldiers saw him coming, a sudden terrifying apparition of buckskin and fury. A few of them shouted a warning. Harris, his veteran's reflexes sharp, pivoted instantly to face the threat. He braced himself, planting his feet firmly in the muddy soil, leveling his long musket to receive the charge. His bayonet, a triangular blade of polished steel, pointed directly at Metakolan's heart. From behind him, Private Clark, in a panic, tried to do the same, clumsily angling his own weapon past the sergeant's shoulder. Their two bayonets formed a confused, overlapping thicket of steel. For a split second, time seemed to slow down. You were there, watching this moment unfold with impossible clarity. You see the grim determination etched on Sergeant Harris's face, the sweat beading on his brow. You see the sheer terror in Private Clark's wide eyes, his mouth open in a silent scream. You see the glint of light on the polished steel of their bayonets. And you see Metakolan. His eyes are not wild with battle lust. They are narrowed, focused, filled with a cold, clear purpose.
His entire body is a coiled spring, unleashed in this single, linear motion. He is not aiming for Harris. He knows the Englishman is braced for the impact, ready to absorb it. Instead, in the last possible instant, he uses a subtle shift of his body, a feint, to draw the sergeant's bayonet slightly to the side. As Harris instinctively adjusts, a fatal gap of a few inches opens up. Metakolan is already moving into it. He doesn't try to parry the bayonets. His spear is too short for that kind of defensive game. It is a purely offensive weapon. The thrust begins not in his arm, but deep in his legs, anchored to the earth. The power travels up through his hips, his torso twisting, his shoulder driving forward. His arm is merely the final link in a kinetic chain, guiding the point to its target. The 5-foot spear, which had looked so inadequate, becomes a projectile launched by the full force of his body weight and momentum. The impact is shocking in its violence and efficiency. The iron spearhead, sharpened to a razor's edge, strikes Sergeant Harris high on the left side of his chest. It punches through the thick red wool of his coat, through his crossbelts, through skin and muscle and rib cage, with a sound like a hammer hitting a side of beef. His eyes go wide with shock and pain. A grunt is forced from his lungs. The sheer momentum of the charge is incredible. Harris is lifted off his feet, his body driven backwards, but the spear does not stop. Private Clark, standing directly behind Harris, has no time to react. He sees his sergeant's body slam into him, feels a sudden, unintelligible, white-hot agony in his own chest. Metakolan's thrust, powered by rage and desperation and a lifetime of training, carries through Harris's body completely. The blood-slicked iron point emerges from the sergeant's back and drives deep into the chest of the young private standing behind him. For one grotesque, frozen moment, the two English soldiers are impaled on the single shaft of ash wood, skewered together like game birds. The spear has pierced through two men at once. The sight is so horrific, so fundamentally impossible, that it shatters the last vestiges of the soldiers' morale. A collective gasp of disbelief and horror ripples through the small circle. Lieutenant Finch stares, his mouth agape, his mind refusing to process what his eyes are seeing. His sword arm drops to his side. Their wall of steel, their discipline, their courage, it all means nothing in the face of such brutal, primal force. Metakolan wrenches the spear free with a powerful twist and pull. The two bodies, now connected only by their shared death, collapse to the ground in a heap. The circle is broken. The psychological dam bursts. The remaining soldiers scream, not in anger, but in pure animal terror. They turn and run, throwing down their muskets, desperate to escape the hellish ravine. They scramble over the bodies of their comrades, their only thought to get away from the silent demon who could kill two men with a single blow. Their flight is short-lived. The other Abenaki warriors who had been waiting for this moment surge from the trees. The end is a merciless flurry of tomahawks and knives. There is no quarter asked, and none is given. The slaughter is absolute. In less than a minute, it is over. Silence descends once more upon the ravine of whispering pines, a silence broken only by the groans of the dying and the gurgle of the river, which was already beginning to run red along its banks. Metakolan stands in the center of the carnage, his chest heaving, his body slick with sweat and the blood of his enemies. He looks down at the spear in his hands. It is coated in gore. The dark iron head and much of the ash shaft stained a deep, wet crimson. The weapon that the English would have mocked is too short, too primitive. The silence that followed the final scream was heavier and more profound than the one that had preceded the battle. It was a weighted silence, thick with the smell of gunpowder, sweat, and freshly spilled blood. The ravine of whispering pines had become a tomb, its floor littered with the broken bodies of 50 men. The victors moved through the scene with a quiet,
grim purpose. There were no shouts of triumph, no boasts of victory. War was a grim necessity, a bloody duty performed to protect their homes, their families, their very existence. This was not a celebration, it was the aftermath of a successful but brutal hunt. Metakolan stood for a long moment, his spear held loosely in his hand, the point resting in the damp earth. He looked at the carnage, at the white faces of the dead, their eyes staring blankly at the gray sky filtering through the pines. He saw the youth in so many of them, boys who should have been farming fields in a distant land, not dying in a forgotten ravine in a world they did not understand. A deep weariness settled into his bones, a soul-deep fatigue that had nothing to do with physical exertion. He had taken life today, many lives. He had done what he must, but the act left a cold stone in his stomach. Kankamagas, the old warrior, came and stood beside him. He placed a hand on Metakolan's shoulder. His own face was splattered with blood, but his eyes were clear. "You fought well," he said, his voice a low rasp. "Your spear sang a true song today. The spirits of our ancestors are pleased." Metakolan nodded, unable to speak. He looked at the bodies of Sergeant Harris and Private Clark, the two men impaled by his single furious thrust. He felt a flicker of something, not pity, but a shared humanity. They were soldiers, following the orders of a man whose arrogance had been their death sentence. "Their leader," Metakolan said, his voice hoarse. "The one they called Finch. He is not among the dead," Kankamagas replied, gesturing with his chin towards the far end of the ravine. "He dropped his sword and surrendered when the circle broke. He is a coward." Metakolan saw him then. Lieutenant Alastair Finch was on his knees, his hands bound behind him with a leather thong. His fine uniform was in tatters, his face was a mask of dirt and despair. Two warriors stood over him with raised tomahawks, awaiting the word. Finch looked up, and his eyes met Metakolan's across the field of slaughter. There was no defiance left, only a hollow, beaten emptiness. He had led 50 men into this ravine. He was the only one who would leave it alive. The Abenaki did not linger. They were not ghouls who gloried in death. They moved efficiently through the fallen, gathering up the weapons. 50 British Brown Bess muskets, bayonets, powder horns, and boxes of cartridges. These were valuable tools of war, a prize almost as significant as the victory itself. They also took the scalps of the fallen, a traditional act that was both a proof of victory and a spiritual necessity, believed to prevent the ghost of a slain enemy from seeking revenge. It was a brutal custom, one that horrified the Europeans, but it was an integral part of the grim calculus of forest warfare. The bodies were left where they lay, to be reclaimed by the forest they had sought to conquer. The wolves and the crows would be their undertakers. The march back to Norridgewock began as dusk fell. The warriors moved in silence, a procession of shadows carrying the spoils of their victory. Their captive, Finch, was forced to walk in their midst, stumbling over roots and rocks, his spirit as broken as his command. He was no longer a proud officer of the king, but a piece of human chattel, his fate entirely in the hands of the people he had dismissed as savages. They arrived at the village late the next day. There were no parades. The warriors entered the clearing quietly, and the women and children came out of the lodges to meet them. The mood was somber and relieved. Anitaby, Metakolan's wife, came to him. She saw the blood on his leggings and the exhaustion in his eyes. She said nothing, but simply took his hand, her touch a small, warm anchor in the cold sea of his thoughts. He went to the river, the cold, clear water of the Kennebec, and washed the blood from his skin and from the shaft of his spear. He scrubbed at the dark stains, the water running red around his hands, but he knew that some stains could never truly be washed away. Later that night, a council was held in the main lodge. Lieutenant Finch was brought before Chief Paudis, the elders and Captain St. Castin, the French officer who had arrived with a small contingent of his own men after receiving word of the impending battle. Finch was shoved to his knees before the fire. He looked up at the faces staring down at him, the weathered, unreadable faces of the Abenaki elders and the grim, professional visage of the French captain. "You're Lieutenant Alastair Finch of the 44th Regiment?" St. Castan asked in perfect, unaccented English. I am. Finch swallowed, his throat dry. You were sent to cut a road through this territory, to build a fort, to displace the people who live here. We did what we were ordered to do, Finch said, a spark of his old defiance returning. We were bringing civilization to this wilderness. Paugus spoke then, his voice quiet, translated by St. Castan. You call this wilderness. We call it home. You call your ways civilization. We see only greed and destruction. You came to our home with axes and guns to drive us out. You were met with the anger of the forest. Do you see now? Finch looked around the lodge, at the calm, resolute faces. He thought of the ravine, of the terrifying efficiency of the warriors, of the way they had used the terrain as a weapon. He thought of the spear that had pierced 2 of his men as if they were made of paper. I underestimated you, Finch admitted, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. We have been fighting men like you for 100 years, Paugus said, his voice heavy with the weight of that history. Your kings and governors change, your uniforms change, but your hunger is always the same. You see this land as something to be owned, to be tamed. We know that we belong to the land. That is the difference between us, and that is why you will always lose in these woods. Finch's fate was debated. The younger warriors, their blood still hot from the battle, wanted to torture and kill him, a slow death to avenge the trespass against their lands. But Paugus and the elders decided otherwise. Death is too easy for a man like this, the chief declared. He will be sent to our French brothers in Quebec. He will live as a prisoner. He will have many years in his cell to remember the price of his arrogance. Let his story be a warning to the other English commanders. Let them know what awaits them if they follow his path. As they led him away, Finch's eyes fell upon Metakolan, who was standing quietly in the shadows at the back of the lodge. His spear was leaning against the wall beside him, clean and dark. In that moment, Finch finally understood. The weapon hadn't been too short. The English vision had been. They had looked at the forest and seen only timber and obstacles. They had looked at the Abenaki and seen only primitive savages. They had failed to see the strength, the skill, the deep, unshakable connection to the land that gave these people their power. They had failed to understand that in the close, tangled fight for survival, it is not the length of the spear that matters, but the spirit of the man who wields it. The story of the battle in the ravine of Whispering Pines and of the incredible spear thrust that broke the English line became a legend. Captain St. Castan recorded it in his official report, a rare, documented account of a feat of arms that bordered on unbelievable. It was told and retold around campfires, a testament to Abenaki courage and a stark warning to their enemies. The English road was halted, at least for that season. The red caterpillars did not advance any further into the Nadinkina. But it was a temporary victory. Metakolan knew this. Standing outside his lodge under a sky full of cold, distant stars, he looked at the dark line of the forest that was his home. He had won a battle, but the war, the long, grinding war for the land and for his people's future, was far from over. More Englishmen would come. Their hunger was, as Paugus had said, endless. But for now, the forest was quiet. The spirits were at peace. He held the ash spear in his hand, its smooth, familiar weight a comfort. It was a simple tool of wood and iron, born of the forest it was sworn to protect. And it would be ready when the time came to sing its true song once more.